The counter on the screen read 12 subscribers. Sophie Reynolds sat in her apartment, the cursor blinking in a steady, rhythmic pulse. Outside, the city lights flickered against the window glass, distant and indifferent. She had spent the last 3 days researching, writing, and refining every sentence until the paragraphs felt like glass. She moved the mouse, hovered over the button, and pressed send. A small notification confirmed the dispatch. The room remained silent. There was no surge of traffic, no sudden spike in activity, no immediate validation. She looked at the empty desk, the stack of notes, and the laptop screen that offered nothing back but a white glow. Most people would have closed the lid and walked away. The effort spent for such a tiny audience felt heavy, almost foolish. She waited for a minute, then 2. Nothing changed. She took a breath, reached out, and opened a blank document for next week. The cycle had to start somewhere. She leaned forward, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to type the first line of the next issue. The apartment stayed quiet, but the document was no longer empty. By day, Sophie sat in a glass-walled office, managing campaigns for firms that burned through budgets like kindling. She watched them chase fleeting trends, throwing thousands of dollars at platforms they did not control. They were tenants on rented land. They paid for clicks, bought temporary visibility, and panicked whenever the algorithm shifted. Sophie sat through meetings where executives obsessed over vanity metrics, ignoring the reality that their reach evaporated the moment the ad spend stopped. She saw the cycle clearly now. They were chasing attention, but they owned nothing. That night, she returned to her apartment with a new focus. No more aimless writing. She opened her laptop and cleared the desktop. She treated her newsletter not as a hobby, but as a business. She set a weekly deadline, not to fill space, but to build a proprietary asset. She defined her audience and mapped a path for growth. The transition was absolute. She stopped playing the game of chasing eyeballs and started building the foundation of a brand. She began to treat every subscriber as a permanent member of her own private ecosystem rather than a transient lead. The strategy was simple. The execution began immediately. Months bled into one another. The growth was not a climb, it was a crawl. Sophie checked her dashboard every morning, only to see the numbers stagnant. 1 subscriber gained, 2 lost. It felt like shouting into a vacuum. On weekends, while others went out, she stayed tethered to her desk. Her friends did not understand. "Why are you doing this?" they asked, watching her refuse invitations. "You are wasting your life on a screen that nobody looks at." She had no answer. She could not explain the vision when the results remained invisible. The doubt began to creep in, quiet and persistent. She would stare at the blank document, fingers hovering over the keys, wondering if the effort was truly a fool's errand. The silence of the apartment felt heavier now, pressing against her ears. She looked at the cursor, blinking with that same rhythmic, mocking pulse. It demanded content she was not sure anyone wanted. She felt the weight of every hour spent editing, every paragraph polished for an audience of ghosts. She could have walked away. She could have joined the others. Instead, she took a long, steady breath, pushed the doubt aside, and forced her fingers to strike the first key. The work continued. The turning point arrived in a dog-eared book. Sophie read the words, "Persistence is the essential factor," and the weight of her uncertainty finally snapped. She stopped writing based on mood and started writing based on system. Every Tuesday morning, at precisely 6, the send button clicked. No excuses. No delays. She began to treat her data as a map rather than a judge. She tracked which subject lines earned a click and which paragraphs caused readers to drop off. She cut the fluff. She tightened the arguments. She turned her writing into a laboratory of optimization. The process became her shield against the slow growth. If the numbers did not move, she changed the variables. She studied the timing of her emails, the structure of her calls to action, and the specific cadence of her tone. She stopped chasing the high of viral spikes and embraced the slow, compounding interest of consistent quality. By the end of the first year, her dashboard shifted. The count hit 300. It was not a massive crowd, but it was a real one. She had built a foundation out of pure, relentless reliability. The frustration of the early days had been forged into a disciplined, data-driven engine that worked even when she was tired. The second year demanded more than just reliability. It demanded connection. As the subscriber count climbed toward the 3,000 mark, the dynamic of the newsletter shifted. It was no longer a monologue sent into the void. It became a two-way street. One Tuesday, after a piece on lean startup methods, a reply hit her inbox. It was not a generic compliment. It was a detailed account of a reader who had used her advice to open a storefront. Sophie read the words 3 times. The static numbers on her dashboard suddenly carried weight. They were not just data points, they were people. Then, more replies followed. A teacher mentioned how her articles helped him restructure his curriculum. A developer shared how her tips on productivity salvaged a failing project. Sophie spent her evenings crafting personal responses to every note. The feedback loop accelerated. Readers began to suggest topics, share their own hurdles, and challenge her assumptions. The comment section under her archives morphed into a forum where strangers supported one another. She had stopped being a writer and started being a hub. The project had evolved from a weekly chore into a living ecosystem. The isolation of the early days was gone, replaced by the persistent, humming energy of a community that relied on her as much as she relied on them. The community was thriving, but the labor was becoming unsustainable. Sophie spent her nights fielding questions and her weekends crafting guides, yet her bank account remained static. She faced a choice: keep the newsletter free and burn out, or ask her readers for support. She spent 3 weeks drafting a digital guide, refining every chapter until the utility was undeniable. The night she prepared to launch, her cursor hovered over the publish button. She feared the reaction. Would they see her as a helper or a profiteer? She clicked send. She set the price, built the landing page for a premium membership, and braced for the silence. The first hour was quiet. Then, a notification pinged. A sale. Then another. The notifications became a steady rhythm on her laptop. By morning, the guide had sold out of its initial digital run, and the membership roster was filling with the very people who had once asked for her advice. She had risked the trust she spent years building, but the response was clear. Her readers did not resent the cost. They valued the expertise. The transition from passion project to viable business was complete, turning her late-night writing into a sustainable engine of revenue. The revenue stream was no longer a trickle. It was a consistent flow that demanded a new way of thinking. Sophie sat with her ledger, tracking the growth of her memberships and course enrollments. She needed a strategy to scale without compromising the quality that built her reputation. One evening, while searching for long-term guidance, she read a passage by Warren Buffett. "Build assets that produce value," he wrote. The words acted as a pivot point. She turned to her archives, scrolling through years of weekly newsletters. She saw hundreds of articles, guides, and deep dives. Previously, these were just entries in a database, dead-ended once the week concluded. Now, she saw them differently. Each article was a permanent asset, a unit of trust waiting to be discovered by a new reader. She began tagging, organizing, and linking her content into a cohesive library. She bundled old insights into evergreen resources. The impact was immediate. New subscribers did not just read the current week, they consumed months of back catalog. The revenue started to compound. Her past work, once considered finished, was now working for her around the clock. She had moved from trading time for money to building a self-sustaining ecosystem of value. The office door opened and a young writer stepped in. He carried a tablet full of analytics, his posture tight with the urgency of a beginner. He had watched her business scale from the outside and wanted the blueprint. He set the tablet on the desk, pointed at her dashboard, and asked the question that had plagued him for months. "How many subscribers do I actually need to make a real living?" Sophie paused. She leaned back, eyes tracking the movement of the city outside her window. She thought of the 12 readers she started with years ago. She thought of the long Tuesdays spent writing when no one was listening. The young writer tapped his screen, waiting for a specific integer, a target, a goalpost. Sophie did not look at the numbers. She looked at him. She closed her laptop, silencing the notifications, and leaned forward into the space between them. She did not provide a count. She did not offer a formula for growth. She looked him directly in the eye and said, "Focus on helping people, not counting them." The room went still. The advice landed, stripped of the usual marketing noise. She had spent 5 years proving that impact was the only metric that mattered. The young writer looked down at his tablet, then back at her, finally understanding the weight of the work. The office fell back into a quiet rhythm once the writer left. Sophie remained at her desk, the screen still dark from her previous conversation. She reached out and tapped the power button. The light caught the edge of her desk as the system booted up. She navigated to her banking portal, a routine task that had become a marker of her progress. She entered her credentials and waited for the page to refresh. The balance appeared. 7 digits. The number sat on the screen, static and cold, representing 5 years of relentless Tuesday deadlines. She did not cheer. She did not call anyone. She simply leaned back in her chair and stared at the figure. The math was not a product of viral trends or lucky breaks. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small disciplined choices. She looked at the cursor blinking in the search bar, a reminder of the work that remained. This balance was not an endpoint. It was the byproduct of staying power. She had survived the period where friends questioned her sanity and the months where growth was invisible. She had outlasted the doubt by treating her output as an essential service. The number on the screen confirmed it. Reliability had become her greatest competitive advantage. The million-dollar balance remained on the screen, but Sophie did not linger on the digits. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the empty space on the desk where she had started years earlier. She remembered the 12 names on that first subscriber list. They were just names then, scattered across a digital void, yet they were the ones who stayed. She had not gone viral. She had not chased shortcuts. She had simply shown up every Tuesday until she became impossible to ignore. The silence of the room was no longer a burden, but a space for the next idea to form. She reached out, her hand steady, and clicked the browser closed. The screen went black, returning the room to its natural light. She did not need to celebrate or announce the milestone to the world. She opened a fresh blank document. The cursor blinked in the rhythm of a steady pulse. She had a newsletter to write for next week. She began to type, the first sentence appearing on the screen. The process was identical to the very first day. The scale had changed, but the work remained the same. She leaned into the keys, focused on providing the next piece of value.